That's okay. It's good for me. We're going to start off with a story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I've mentioned him in here before. Actually, I feel like I've been talking about him so much lately that I'm almost sick of talking about him, or I feel like people are sick of hearing about him, but probably none of you are like that. How many of you have even have a good idea of who he is? Raise your hand if you have a good idea of who he is. Okay, some people in the room. We're going to start off with him today because he's just a fantastic illustration of what we're going to get at in the message today. We're talking about faith, we're talking about heroes of the faith, and he certainly is one of those. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Christian and a pastor, and actually a seminary professor, so someone who was training pastors, in the time period leading up to World War II in Germany, and also during World War II. And he died just 3 weeks before the end of the war by special order from the high command of the Nazis. They gave a special order to execute him in particular before the war ended. And the way that his life went, he grew up in a home that was sort of nominally Christian. They were very well educated. They were kind of the elite class of German society. They were one of his relatives had worked with the project that first split the atom, for example. They were really high-end guys, elite Germans. And his family was never sort of part of the whole Nazi party, except at the end they were mostly as spies or as conspirators against the Nazi party. But even though he grew up in a nominally Christian household, so they weren't really following after Jesus, at an early age he became, through reading the Bible and through some other people, he became a profoundly deep follower of Jesus. And actually his family thought it was very strange. And when he told them he wanted to become a pastor, they thought he was weird. And as nothing was too remarkable about him in his years growing up, other than that he was pretty intelligent and he was going after Jesus with great zeal. But as he grew, he built a pattern of really trying to become like Christ. And this is important. I often have this thought in my mind. This is true with all of the heroes of faith that we're looking at. They became what we would call heroes of faith, or famous people, famous for what they did through their faith in Jesus. They became that partly because of their circumstances. And also then partly because of what they had become in the other times, what they had become leading up to that. So all the people we're looking at had followed after Jesus, had followed after God, and God had changed them more and more to become who they should be on the inside. And then some powerful circumstance came into their life that made it become apparent what was on the inside of them. Do you follow me in this? So there are many people who are just like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and what I'm about to tell you about him. But those people are just living everyday, ordinary lives, and it would take an extraordinary circumstance to reveal what's on the inside of those people. So I often have this thought as a pastor. I've shared it with you before. Here we are, we're doing church. We're saying we're going to grow in our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. That's our goal. Are we really achieving that goal? I often ask myself that question. What if some incredibly difficult circumstance came to Canada? What if it came to British Columbia or to Surrey, to North Delta? What if we were challenged in our faith? What if all of a sudden being a Christian didn't mean, I have to get up early on Sunday mornings, that's the most difficult thing, and show up at church? What if the difficulty in being a Christian was suddenly, I'm going to be killed, or I'm going to lose everything that I have if I really follow after Jesus and stand up for what's right? All of a sudden, it would be revealed what's on the inside of each one of us, wouldn't it? It would come out into the open. And I'm constantly asking myself the question, would I stand in that situation? What would our church look like in that situation? What would the churches I don't know the answer, only God knows the answer. But our job is to press in and do everything in our power to follow God so that he can shape us into people who would stand the test in that situation. Just like it says in Hebrews chapter 12. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer and all these heroes of faith, they're people who have been through these kind of situations, and so their faith was revealed. So what happens with him, I think the most remarkable part is that right from the beginning of the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, when many people were saying, they were kind of deceived at the beginning. Well, we're not sure if we don't agree with everything they say, but they might have a good point. Hitler's got some good stuff going on here. He wants to make the country strong again. That's really great. And many church leaders actually were following after and then eventually became part of the Nazi Party in Germany. But right from the beginning, we're talking about within a week of Hitler being announced at winning the chancellorship and taking over the government in Germany, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was on national radio arguing against Hitler's platform on moral grounds, arguing that where Hitler was talking about just becoming strong and ruling over other people, really, and putting down the Jewish people, all of this was going to lead to a really bad place. He was on record, on national air in Germany against Hitler within a week of his being elected. So he was not deceived at all. He and a small number of others instantly, almost instinctively saw this is evil and it will lead the wrong way. And he resisted the entire time, took a stand against evil. Now, as things went on, more and more church leaders were deceived. The church eventually became part of the Nazi Party. Dietrich Bonhoeffer and some of his other friends formed a different church, a secret underground church they called the Confessing Church, that would not agree to the Nazi policies. They eventually, as I mentioned before, he and his family eventually they joined the Nazi Party so that they could get on the inside and work against it. They created they were part of a network of spies. He was eventually part of a conspiracy actually to kill Hitler. They tried to blow him up with a briefcase. There's been a lot of publicity about that attempt to kill Hitler. And in the end, he eventually was arrested. The conspiracy was brought out into the open. He was arrested first for hiding Jewish people, and then when the conspiracy came out into the open, they found out he was actually a traitor to the state, and he was sent to a concentration camp where he helped a lot of people, but eventually was killed by special order from the highest command in Germany just before the end of the war. It's actually a sad story, right? Right before the end of the war, 3 weeks later, if he had survived 3 weeks longer, he would have been free. The concentration camp he was in was liberated by the Allies 3 weeks after he was executed. But for him, and we'll talk about that at the end, that was not sad. And he made it very clear to those around him that this for him was not the end of life, it was the beginning. So the main point that we're going to get across today from our hero of faith, who is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, is very much like our hero of faith for today, who is Zechariah. The main point, and you can fill this on your notes if you'd like, is this, that faith, real faith, always takes a stand against evil. It's not just that faith should take a stand against evil, or even that it must, but that it simply does. So if real faith in Jesus is present deeply in a human being, that faith will resist evil automatically in the world around it. So a person of faith will always resist evil in the world around them. Now, sometimes a person can feel that need to resist evil and still give in and not resist. But real faith, when we're acting in faith, always takes a stand against evil. I'm going to read you this next section so we're looking at heroes of faith, Hebrews chapter 11. We've been looking at all these different heroes. Last week we talked about Gideon, and we talked about what is it actually like to hear from God. We've been talking about how the pattern for growing in our faith is simply this, that we decide to give our lives to Jesus. We decide to follow after him. We ask him for help, and we figure out, what is it that he wants me to do? What's the next thing he wants me to do? We can actually hear from God, and we talked about that a lot last week. And once we know the next thing that God is asking me to do, faith looks like actually doing it, actually taking a step. Sometimes it's real scary. Sometimes, as we'll see today, there's resistance from other people, from the evil that's in the world around us. But we've got to go against that. We've got to stand against it and take the step of faith anyway. And when we do, that's when our faith grows, because we see God show up in amazing ways. Okay? So, in Hebrews 11, we're done with all the people that the author of Hebrews goes through in detail. And now we're into a number of people that he goes through, and he says, he's talking to people who are not sure if they want to continue in their faith because it's really hard. And now we're in a section where he's just listing off a whole bunch of people. And we started that last time with Gideon. All these people, he says he actually doesn't have time to go through all these people. So we're going to take the time and go through some of them. We went through Gideon last week. So if we are, we're at Hebrews 11, starting at verse 32. And it says this, "What more shall I say? I don't have time to tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning, and that's the one we're going to look at today. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith. Yet none of them received what had been promised in this life, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect." So here we have this long list in Hebrews 11 of just all these other people that he could point to. He doesn't take the time to tell all the stories. He's assuming his readers know many of these Bible stories. And some of us know them, and many of those stories are obscure and we don't know them. We're going to be looking at a really obscure one today, and that is the story of Zechariah, son of Jehoiada. Okay, that's a really easy. Everybody say Jehoiada 10 times fast. Not really. You don't have to do that. So Zechariah, the story is actually pretty short. So we're going to hear the story now, and it comes in 2 Chronicles chapter 24. And the context, what's just been happening here, we're in the nation of Judah. So this is after the time of Moses, after the time of David and Solomon and the kings, and lots of bad kings had come into the nation of Judah. Lots of kings who were bad because they weren't following the right way. They were doing all kinds of awful things as the leaders of the government. But then there came this king named Joash. And Joash took the throne when he was really, really young. And the priest, the one who was the leader of the church or the temple at that time, following after God, he was an advisor to this king. And while he was young, the king listened to this priest who was named Jehoiada, okay, Zechariah's dad. And Jehoiada told the king, okay, this is how you got to do things. You got to stop, murdering people and stop sacrificing babies in the fire. That's bad, okay? And don't steal or extort things from people. And so he's teaching, and you got to worship only the true God. So he's teaching the king to do all these things. And so all the people, following the pattern set by the king, started following after the one true God and serving him. But what happened is, as soon as Jehoiada died, because he was a lot older, Joash was inundated. All these people came to him, all these officials and people who were against God and following all kinds of evil ways, and convinced him to turn back the other way. And that's where we come to the story of Zechariah. So he is the son of the priest who had helped the king go the right way, but now his dad is dead, and the king has turned his back on God, and the king is doing all kinds of evil stuff. So this is a dangerous situation. And it's clear that Zechariah knows that if he takes a stand against the king and all of these officials, he's probably a dead man. And here's what happens. So starting in verse 17 of 2 Chronicles 24. After the death of Jehoiada, the officials of Judah came and paid homage to the king, and he listened to them. So they flattered him. They told him how awesome he was. Now do what we say. They abandoned the temple of the Lord, the God of their ancestors, and they worshipped Asherah poles and idols. Because of their guilt, God's anger came upon Judah and Jerusalem. Although the Lord sent prophets to the people to bring them back to him, and though he testified against them, they would not listen. So Zechariah is not the only one sent by God to say, come on, turn back, please. This is going to destroy the nation if you go this way. Then the Spirit of God came on Zechariah, son of Jehoiada the priest. He stood before the people, so he's public declaration, and he says, this is what God says. Why do you disobey the Lord's commands? You will not prosper. Because you have forsaken the Lord, he has forsaken you. But they plotted against him. And by order of the king, they stoned him to death in the courtyard of the Lord's temple. Right in church. This is what we're talking about here. In the middle of the church, with everybody there, they stoned him to death. King Joash did not remember the kindness Zechariah's father, Jehoiada, had shown him. That's important. We'll come back to that later. The king doesn't remember. But God remembers. He didn't remember the kindness Zechariah's father, Jehoiada, had shown him, but killed his son, who said as he lay dying, may the Lord see this and call you to account. What happens next is that, of course, God is in control over all things. Even though he allows human beings, we've talked about this during this series of messages, he allows human beings to make their own choices, but he's so powerful. He's so powerful that even over all of that, he can arrange things so that they turn out good. They turn out the way he decides. And so Joash, the king, after this, goes into battle, and he makes all these preparations to make sure he's perfectly safe in the battle, and he's still killed anyway. Because God's in control, not Joash the king, not these priests who turn away from God. So this is the story of Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada. There's a couple different Zechariahs in the Bible. This is not actually the Zechariah who, there's a book of the Bible called Zechariah, different Zechariah. There's a lot of people with the same names back then, just like there are today, but it's a little confusing for us because we don't recognize their names as well as we do names we're more familiar with. So let's talk about this first, taking a stand against evil. Here we see Zechariah do this just like we saw Dietrich Bonhoeffer stand against evil, sort of automatically. You can see that this would have been a really scary thing for Zechariah to do, to take this stand. He knows that in all likelihood, unless God does some kind of miracle to save him, he's going to be killed if he takes this stand. He's standing against the political party that's ruling his country. And they are really evil, and they're ready to kill people who are in their way, just like Dietrich Bonhoeffer did in Nazi Germany. And of course, in this case, and we'll come back to this at the end, God does not do a miracle to save Zechariah. Oh man, why not? But Zechariah is prepared. Whether or not God saves him, he is prepared to resist this evil, even though he knows it could cost him his life. And we saw that with Dietrich Bonhoeffer too. It's almost like there's no question in their minds. Even though they see what it could cost them, it's not a choice. It's obvious to them. They must resist this evil. So why? How do they get to that point? Let's talk a little bit about the plan of Jesus here. The plan of Jesus for reforming the world. This world that we live in is actually full of evil all around us. This is what the Bible says. Human beings all the time, normal human beings, are thinking in patterns that are very twisted and lead to really bad things. And it actually takes deep, deep work of God's Spirit over a long time to help us see that evil that's in ourselves and then move away from it. And so as we walk through this world, I know we've grown up in it. It's like a fish in water, right? Fish probably don't recognize that they live in water because they've always been in water until they're removed from the water. Then they all of a sudden recognize it. But we don't recognize most of the time that we live in a world full of evil until we're pulled out of that evil, until we see a different way. That's why we need Jesus. He is the light that was sent down into the darkness of this world. That's how one of the stories of Jesus' life, the Gospel of John, the book of John, who records Jesus' life, that's how it opens up, right in that very first chapter. The light came into the world. Jesus is like a light, and the world was like darkness. And when the light first came into the world did not understand it. The darkness could not understand the light. It was so different. But the darkness also could not overpower the light. It tried. The light comes into the world, and the darkness tries to take it over. But it can't. Just like when a light comes into a dark room, can the darkness of the room overpower the light? It cannot. Because light, when it comes, darkness is simply gone. Now, do you have that experience where maybe you're waking up in the morning, and if you wake up early, it's super dark in your room, and even just that light from your cell phone, how many of you turn your phone on as the first thing in the morning? Probably a lot of you. Even just that light from the screen of your cell phone can totally change the room, even though it's not even a strong light. But the darkness cannot overpower light. The light will change the darkness, though the darkness will fight against it. And so this is the pattern in Jesus that we see. This is why Jesus told his followers again and again, the world hates me. The world will attack me and try to kill me, but don't worry, I have overcome the world. The world can't actually do anything to defeat me because I am the light. So Jesus would say things like, don't resist an evil person. And what he meant is, you don't have to worry. Just trust God and follow him. We do take a stand against evil, which Jesus repeatedly demonstrated in his life. But we don't have to worry because the light will eventually defeat the darkness. The darkness cannot win. It's not possible in the long run. But he told his followers, so this is what it's like. I'm like light in the world, and the darkness is going to try to attack me, but it's not going to win because it can't. And then he went on to explain that his followers would be the same way. So in Matthew chapter 5, I'm not going to read it for you, but in this famous section called the Sermon on the Mount, at the beginning of that, Jesus explains how it's going to work for people who truly try to follow him. And the way that it works is, you are going to become more and more like him. His Holy Spirit is going to live in you. He's going to forgive you of sin by dying on the cross, and then he's going to give you his Spirit to live inside of you. And when that happens, you're going to become, he says, like salt and light. Just like he is the light that comes into the world, so his followers are going to be like, not quite as bright of lights, we have to admit, don't we? But lights just like him in the darkness. And what we need to do is make sure we don't hide that light, because the only thing that can keep that light from shining is us. The darkness cannot overpower it. But he says you're going to be like a light in the world, just like I was, but then the darkness is going to try to destroy that light too. But we see that light automatically resists the darkness. Just by its very nature. Light doesn't have to think about, should I overcome the darkness and make a choice to do it. Light just does, because that's what it is. And so it is with people who become followers of Jesus and who follow after him. As we become more like him, that light living in us will automatically resist the patterns of evil in the world around us. Those patterns of evil in extreme times look like the Nazi government or like King Joash, but they are all over the place in normal times. They are the ways people don't forgive each other in the world. The ways that people are always looking out for themselves first and not really thinking of others first. The ways that people are unloving to other people. All of these patterns, all of these things are the ways that evil is the regular way of life in this world around us. That's the darkness. And as we grow in Christ, we will, by faith, start to naturally resist those things. It will be automatic. Let me read for you from Ephesians chapter 5. We're going to see a little bit more. In some ways, this is an explanation of how this works. So in Ephesians chapter 5 at verse 8, Paul, who was a follower of Jesus in the early days, is explaining this same idea, how the light living in us will automatically resist the darkness and what we need to do with that. He says in verse 8, you were once darkness. He doesn't even just say you were in darkness. He says once you were darkness. But now because you've given your life to Christ, asked him to live in you, you are light in the Lord. You have become light as you live in God. So live as children of the light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. Find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. This is Paul's instruction to us on how we're to live as the light in the world. We must expose the darkness, helping other people to see it for what it is. Remember I said, it's like a fish in water. We grow up in this dark world, so at first we don't recognize what darkness is. But those who have started to follow Jesus will automatically, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, be able to see it. And it is the duty of those who can see what's evil, who can see what's wrong in the world, to tell others. Now we got to do it in love, and there's a lot of things to be said there, but we must do it. We must expose the darkness and show it for what it is. It's shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. Verse 12. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible. That's how we get rid of darkness. Not by attacking it, but by letting people see what it really is. By exposing it to the light. And everything that is illuminated becomes a light. It's an amazing verse. So how then should we do this? So far what we've said is, okay, heroes of faith, we're trying to follow God, we're trying to grow in our faith. We see Dietrich Bonhoeffer, we see Zechariah automatically resisting evil. We've said that faith takes a stand, it always takes a stand against the patterns of evil in the world around us. We said that we see in Ephesians chapter 5, we must resist evil by exposing it. So how then do we do it? And the next thing we want to say here is that we must take a stand against evil. This is the second point for your notes if you want to fill this in. You can only stand against evil by following the Spirit. That's the only way it can be done. And what I mean here when I say this is not just that the only way you can succeed in defeating evil is by the Spirit. Actually, the only way to resist evil, the only way to really resist it and not just become involved in it, is to follow the Spirit of God. Why is that? That is because the human heart is still full of sin, and we can easily go the wrong way. Most of the evil around us in the world comes from, we're going a little bit deep here, but most of the evil around us in the world comes from people starting out with a good idea of how to do something good, but trying to do it in their own power. And then the evil in the world around them, and an enemy who's very real, we call Satan the deceiver, is able to twist that evil, or twist their good intention and turn it toward evil. This is exactly the case with the Nazis. They didn't think they were doing something bad, especially not at the beginning. They started out trying to improve the situation, but in their own strength without God, and it turned into one of the greatest evils in history. The same thing with the communist movements that came before and after them, starting out by trying to improve the situation for poor people. How is that not a good thing? It ends up in massive systematic oppression and murder. That's what happens every time human beings try to solve problems in our own strength. So the only way to really resist evil at all is to give up our own lives and say, Lord Jesus, we're going to follow you. I'm going to give my life to you. Wherever your Spirit leads me, that's where I'm going to go. Let me read another passage for you. This one, same author as the last one from Ephesians. This one is from a letter called the letter to the Galatians. And we'll see this idea that it's the Spirit who is able to resist evil. As you follow the Spirit of God and allow Him to rule your life, you allow Him to live in you and through you, that's how you resist evil and defeat it. So here's Galatians chapter 5, starting at verse 16. Paul says this, I say, walk by the Spirit. Walk, so live your regular life by following the Spirit of God. And you will not gratify or give in to the desires of the flesh. And the flesh is a term meaning sort of the evil, wrong desires that are kind of in us, built into us almost. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you should not do just whatever you want. Have you ever come to a point in your life when you realize that if you just do whatever you want, hopefully you came to this point when you were a little kid and your parents helped you. If you just do whatever you want in the moment, your life doesn't turn out very good, does it? You don't turn into a very good person. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. He goes on to give these lists. I don't think I have all of this up on the screen, but he goes on to give these lists of what it looks like, what the darkness actually looks like. He says that the darkness is obvious to people who are living in the light. The list goes something like this, goes like this. The acts of the flesh or the darkness are sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions and factions, envy and drunkenness, orgies and everything like that. And he warns not to live like this. He then goes on to explain what happens, or what the fruit, what comes from people who live in the light. And that's this one. I don't know, have all, those of you who have children in Sunday school, have all of your children been singing the fruits of the Spirit like my kids have been singing them? So that's this one. This is the passage where Paul explains it. If you live in the light, what will happen is that what will come out of that is, say it with me if you know it, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, faithfulness. Yeah, I have to sing it as a song to say it. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, woohoo, gentleness, and self-control. That's what comes out of letting that light live in you, and it will automatically resist the darkness, and you will come into conflict with the darkness around you without even trying. That's actually one of the big problems of being a Christian and following after Jesus. That's why often life gets harder in some ways after we start really following after God. Because when we weren't following after God, we weren't fighting against the darkness around us. We were going along with it, going with the flow of everything in this world. But when that light starts to live in us, the darkness doesn't like it. Because everywhere that light shows up, it challenges the darkness. And the darkness knows it will eventually be pushed out. Those systems of evil that are in the world around us will be defeated by it. And the darkness fights against it. And so your life often becomes harder as soon as you start following after Jesus, not easier. But here Paul has told us clearly that the way to fight against this, the way to resist evil, is by following the Spirit of God. We must take his lead. So it doesn't look like I see a pattern of evil, and so I make a plan and try to destroy it. No. Sometimes God might lead us to do things, and that's what we saw from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, right? He actually was led, but this was over a period of years of following after God and wrestling over, should I actually try to do something to defeat this great evil, like kill Hitler? And eventually God's answer to him was, yes, do it. That might be surprising to us, but he felt like there was no other right thing he could do in his life. His next right step was blow up the leader of my country because he's done so much evil, and that's the only thing I can see God leading me to do. But many other times, the answer is simply speak. Simply speak and watch God's power work, and that's what we saw in Zechariah, even though it caused his death. God's answer to him was simply speak this out, even though it's going to mean that you die. So let's talk about that as our final section for this morning in the message. What happens if we resist evil? And in a situation just like Zechariah, we resist evil, we do what God's asking us to do, and something really awful happens to us as a result. Zechariah resists evil. He makes this great step of faith. He's doing everything for God, and he's stoned to death. Immediately his life is over. We can think of a ton of people in the Bible who are just like this. One of the great ones that comes to my mind is John the Baptist, if you know his story. Same thing. He's followed after God his whole life intensely. He spent his time just in prayer and worship to God, and he's willing to stand against the whole country, all the leaders of the country who are opposed to him. He goes and tells one of the leaders of the country that this person is doing something really wrong. He calls it out, and he's put in prison for a long time, and then he's beheaded. End of his life. Where was God in that? Where was God in that? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, at the end of his life, he's 3 weeks away from getting out of prison, from being able to live his life and see the deliverance of God, the deliverance of his country, even though it's a really difficult thing that Germany was going through. He's 3 weeks away from it. God could have easily organized things, and there are others. If any of you know the story of Corrie ten Boom, who was also in prison in Germany at that very moment, and God miraculously delivered her from prison and from being executed by a clerical error. That's what God used to deliver her. She was miraculously delivered. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was executed. So shouldn't he have been really angry? He should have said, God, where were you? Why didn't you show up? I followed you with everything I had, and you didn't show up. That's worthless. My faith is worthless. No. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer was being led away from his fellow prisoners who he had been taking care of and pastoring and mentoring and trying to teach them to follow Jesus in a concentration camp, he says to them, don't you think for 1 minute that this is the end of my life. This is nothing else for me than the beginning of life. Don't be sad for me. Be sad for yourselves who remain in the world full of evil and darkness. I'm about to be set free. Corrie ten Boom was miraculously saved by a clerical error so that she could speak a powerful message and help those who still were living in darkness. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was given a pass. You've done enough. You've done what you were called to do. You are now set free. Let me read for you again from Hebrews chapter 11. And this is the powerful word in verses 13 to 16 that he's trying to get across to us. We've looked at this a couple times during this message series. Many of these people who were great heroes of faith, they stepped out in faith and God did astonishing things through them, showed up in miraculous ways. That's all to help all of us who are living in darkness here in this world. But many others who stepped out in faith simply died or they suffered greatly. But look at what it says. All these people, whether God did amazing miracles in response to their faith or not, were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things that were promised to them. At least not here in this life, that's what he's saying. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, one that's not full of darkness, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. God is making a new world, and we have to keep our eyes fixed on that. We'll be talking about that the next 2 weeks as we look at our last 2 heroes of faith over the next 2 weeks. God has prepared a new world, a new place, and it is a place that will not be full of darkness. And so it doesn't matter really what happens to us as we step out in faith. And that's our last point here. Last point for your bulletin, for your notes is this. Even if no one stands with you, God will remember. Zechariah stood up, he took this great leap of faith, and he was stoned to death. And as he's dying, we saw that he thinks to himself, he remembers that Joash, the king, who was evil, didn't remember all the things that his dad had done. All the things his dad had done to help the king, to lead him the right way. He forgot all about them. It was like his dad's work didn't even matter anymore. And even now that Zechariah is standing up in faith, no one is standing with him. Not a single person stands up to defend him. They stone him to death in the middle of church. And he complains. He's got this complaint. No one's remembering. No one's remembering the right way. Do you know what the name Zechariah means? Zechariah, I named my second son Zechariah because it means the Lord remembers. His very name. And I think as he's dying, he remembers this, that even though none of these human beings around me remember all the things that I've done, that my dad did, that we did in faith for God, it looks like everything is failing. It looks like I'm just dead and that's the end of this. God remembers. And he will make this turn out right in the end. And that's what we need to remember. As we walk through this world of darkness, as the light in us resists the evil around us, we need to expose it. We need to do it by the Spirit. And we need to remember that no matter what the outcome, God remembers what we have done. And our faith is not in vain. It will turn out to be better than we can possibly imagine now. Let's keep walking forward in faith. Let's pray, and we'll continue in worship. God in heaven,